And we're good to go.
All right. Let me just pull up my notes. All right, great. Thanks, Meg, and welcome back, everyone. I hope everybody had an engaging and informative morning. And I want to thank all our morning presenters. We had some great sessions, and I'm sure our afternoon will be just as informative. And a big thank you to our keynote speaker, who I'll introduce in just a moment, Jennie Rose Halperin. We will be recording these sessions and sending everything out to all the registered participants after the summit concludes. And I just want to remind you, please stay muted. There'll be plenty of time at the end of Jennie's presentation for questions and discussions, so we can unmute then if you'd like. So I will introduce our keynote now. Jennie Rose Halperin is a digital strategist, community builder, and librarian who serves as the director of Library Futures, a project of the Engelberg Center on Innovation, Law, and Policy at New York University School of Law. The organization is made up of library workers, educators, lawyers, activists, technologists, and researchers. She's focused on growing the organization and its reach by fostering a culture of open, inclusive leadership to support equitable library policy, technology, and advocacy. Jennie joined Library Futures from Harvard Law School Library, where she served as the Assistant Director for Outreach and Community Engagement. Previously, she managed communications for Creative Commons and worked on growth and community at O'Reilly Media and Mozilla. A committed civic leader, in 2018, she was chosen for Boston Mayor Marty Walsh's Spark cohort for millennial leaders and received a new urban mechanics public space invitational grant in 2019. In 2021, Jennie was named a visionary by Public Knowledge, who called her a future leader who will drive tech policy in the public interest for the next 20 years. From 2021 to 2022, Jennie was on the Community Advisory Board for Invest in Open Infrastructure and is currently an advisor for the Flickr Foundation. Jennie's completed the Coaching Fellowship, Outreachy, and the CBYX Exchange for Young Professionals in Germany. Jennie received her MLS from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as a Carolina Academic Library Associate and her BA from Barnard College of Columbia University. She is currently a candidate for an executive master's in public administration from NYU's Wagner School of Public Service as part of the Global Public Leaders Program. Welcome, Jennie. Thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Corey. I need to get a shorter bio. I think that was pretty long.
It shows how accomplished you are. So
Thank you so much. Thank you in particular to Corey for inviting me and for following up so much and making sure that everything is ready, and to the organizing committee, to putting this conference on, and to everyone who's joining us today. I really appreciate it. Again, I am Jennie Rose Halperin, and I work at Library Futures, which is actually this month 4 years old as an organization, and we couldn't be happier. So where are we going to go? So this talk is about libraries, digital ownership, and the cloud. What are we doing? It's going to be a tiny bit digressive, a tiny bit interactive, hopefully fun. So we'll see how it goes. So we're going to first start with asking the question of where is the internet? The next question is pretty provocative. Is cloud computing destroying the future of content? What does this mean from a copyright perspective? What do we lose? And of course, the question on everyone's mind, which is Hachette versus Internet Archive, which was decided a few weeks ago, part 2 in the Second District Court. And what have libraries got to do with it? So, but first, before I start, a report. So our wonderful director of programs and expert on OER, Michelle Reed, did a study of OER usage among public librarians. It was a survey and qualitative interviews. It should be out next week. It's currently with a designer and copy editor. So I'm going to send it to Corey. I didn't want to present somebody else's research, so I'm going to talk on a different subject, but please read it. It's super informative. It's short, and it has great charts and graphs. And if any of you are interested in talking to Michelle about it, she would also, I'm sure, love to present it or to chat with you about it. So a little bit of library technology trivia. Okay, drop in the chat, what came first, ARPANET or OCLC? So ARPANET, the first internet, or OCLC? Trying to see if I can figure out how to get the chat. Oh, there we go. Okay, yep, it's totally right. It was OCLC. So OCLC as a system for libraries predates the internet. And so this is just, the reason why I'm starting with this is a really good example of the ways in which libraries have really led on technology over time, from the 60s even till now, and to sort of set the stage to say that libraries should continue to lead and can continue to lead. So we're going to start by focusing on the cloud. So the thing I want to focus on is how cloud computing changed the way that we access databases and that we provide access to databases, and changed the way that we access information, both as consumers and as patrons. And so we all know that there have been many, many innovations in databases since OCLC began, since the beginning of library databases, but I'm going to focus on the rise of the cloud as a crucial part of how we got here and where we're going. I'm going to hop very, very, very far into the future to cloud computing. It took shape around 2006, and you can probably guess maybe which company started and led the way for cloud computing. They currently control the cloud infrastructure for a large majority of the internet. It is Amazon, of course. AWS is a consolidated system that is based in the cloud. In about 2006, it really changed the way that we do computing. So, but in order to answer this question, it's really good to have a general idea of how the internet works, which I'll get to in just a moment. So some of the things that really work about cloud computing is it's convenient. You're being sold a product rather than a technology. It has this feeling of auto magic, like we're streaming to the cloud right now. It will just kind of land in your inbox after. It's simple, it's easy. It feels like it will be here forever, even though while we all Zoom now, Zoom may not be a company forever, probably won't. And the last is data. There's a huge amount of data that is produced through cloud computing, and that data is handled for us. And that's a really strange and unique thing about cloud computing that I think has really changed the way that we access technology as public servants and also as consumers. So if you've heard some of the library features stuff before, we talk a lot about consolidation in the market. We talk a lot about market control and corporate capture, public services. I'm actually not going to really talk about that today, but I'd be happy to answer questions at the end. So where's the internet? Have you ever wondered, like, where's the internet? Because I have. So the question of how does my data get from one place to the other? Where is it stored? Where does it go? So the very short answer is that people produce data. That data travels through undersea and overland fiber optic cables and into a data center, which are located all around the world and store the data that people create. So the very basic structure looks like this. So the question is, like, why do we do this now? So some of us might be old enough, I'm just old enough to remember these huge hot server rooms at various companies. You can go ahead and put in the chat if you remember this, to have to avoid or be near the server room and your office. And this still exists in certain highly compute-centric industries, like banking and certain technology companies. But most data now is held in what's called a tenant situation in the cloud. So you rent space and that space is kind of filled. And then the next question is to ask, why do you think that up to 80%, approximately 80% in total of the internet runs through Reston, Virginia? or really Northern Virginia in general? Like, what historic reason could it be that the vast majority of the data that runs the internet runs through Northern Virginia? You can drop in the chat. What's there? Like, what in particular is in Northern Virginia? It's the Pentagon. So yes, thank you. So of course, as many of us know, the internet came out of military technology in many ways, and still, as a historic fact, the majority of the internet runs through Northern Virginia, which presents a number of problems and also opportunities for the area that I'm not going to get into here, but it's just kind of an interesting part of the internet. And so while this has ushered in incredible connectivity and immediate access, it's also complicated a lot of things. So these are the different kinds of ways that people store data in data centers. So I'm going to be honest, I did make these 2 slides about data centers for another talk, but I thought they were so interesting that I am including them. So the amount of data that is produced by computing has increased 146% over the past 15 years. It consumes about 4% of the world's total energy. 1.7% of all electricity in the United States is used by data centers, and global data center electricity use is probably by 2030 going to consume more than 10% of all data. And the thing about data centers is they're very hot. And in a warming climate, this is becoming a huge problem. People do not know where to put them. There's land use questions, there are heat questions, there's electricity questions. They use a lot of water, they use a lot of resources. And while building net zero data centers has become a priority of large data-centric industries and companies, it is still an ongoing issue, and one that is going to probably come to a head within the next few years of what are we going to do with all the data that we produce. So lots of more facts about data centers, including that they have a higher carbon footprint than the airline industry right now, which I found very interesting. 40% of the electricity, as I said, has to do with cooling the data centers. And 65% of all internet traffic is run through data centers owned by Google, Microsoft, or Amazon, with AWS dominating at 32%. And I said I wasn't going to talk about consolidation, but you just can't help it when you're talking about the internet. So the only way that any of this could happen is through constant, complete connectivity on your little computers in your pocket, your phones, and on your computers. And this really has been enabled by smartphones and the rise of connected devices. So I'm going to ask for another question in the chat. So anybody who's been working in libraries for a while, if there's anybody in this call who has been, if you want to maybe type in the chat a little bit about how users used to get access to digital materials before the rise of streaming and consolidated vendors and mobile access to ebooks and articles. I'm going to keep moving on, but if you have a thought or something you want to share about that, please do in the chat. I know that databases, even when I was in college, looked very, very different than they do now. And while they were still consolidated into one system, right, we also had CDs, we had microfiche, we had laser disc, and all these different floppy disks, USB sticks. Things were owned, they weren't immediately served to you, and then sort of living on these platforms. And I know in academic libraries, they still largely are. However, the way that people access them has just changed through the rise of cloud computing. So Jason Schultz is the faculty advisor here at the Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy. He wrote a fantastic book called The End of Ownership, which I highly, highly recommend if any of these topics are interesting to you. I'm going to quote semi-extensively from it because it really is a great book and explains a lot of the issues as to why digital ownership is important now in the 2020s. So what he writes is that the lack of physical possession is implicit in cloud-based distribution. In the hard copy and digital download eras, you literally possessed your copies. They were stored on shelves in attics and on hard disks, but if you possess copies in the cloud, you only do so virtually. They aren't actually on your device. That's the whole point. You're pulling from this cloud storage. And so there are lots of really good reasons why people move to the cloud. So if you also remember syncing your media onto physical devices, it was truly annoying. I was going through my stuff a couple of weeks ago, and I found a digital camera that I probably have not used since 2012 or 2013. And I tried to plug it in to get access to whatever was on the card. I couldn't even turn it on. It's broken. And so getting my materials off of that is going to be more challenging than it would be if I had, for example, which is what I ended up doing back in 2012, put them on Google Photos, and they're there, and I can access them at any time, and I can see my photos from 2012 that I had synced from my digital camera. But the digital camera itself as a device to try to sync it and own it rather than store it in the cloud is just non-functional now, 10 years later. There is ubiquitous mobile access. Streaming is a much more efficient capture of user data, which is super important to this. Rather than charging one purchase, companies can continuously charge consumers. So for the convenience of being able to access incredible catalogs of music, rather than buying a CD, I might pay $9.99 in perpetuity to Spotify. And when I stop paying, I lose access to that library, which is a very new way of thinking about content. Digital objects are maintained by the owners, not the users, which makes files less lossy and the format more consistent. And as I just said, people kept losing access to digital materials. So the move to the cloud makes a lot of sense, but it does come with serious trade-offs. So here's some statistics about streaming services, so you can see just how big the market is for streaming services. I thought 15 million years of the accumulative time American stream video content in 2021. It's kind of wild. I mean, it was during the pandemic, but still, I think I watched 160 movies in 2021 because there was nothing else to do. So maybe all 15 million years are me. The next thing that I wanted to bring up is the environmental cost of music. You can see that it's changed over time, but streaming produces the most amount of greenhouse gas because of the amount of data that it produces, and the data issue with data centers has still not been figured out. But you can also see that in terms of economic cost, the economic cost has gone down significantly. It costs almost nothing comparatively to producing, storing, shipping CDs than to stream. And so you see as the costs to large rights holders and large companies have gone down, the environmental cost has gone in certain ways significantly up, and in some ways it's gone down. So again, trade-offs. So if you've ever heard this phrase, the cloud is just someone else's computer, it's kind of true, but as we've started to see, it's of course a lot more complicated than that. So Jason Schultz writes that the engineers behind cloud services have done a remarkable job of shielding us from their complexity, of which they are very complex. Those services are intuitive, and the downside of such high usability is that it obfuscates details about precisely how these services operate. So there are three things primarily, although there are many, many different things that we lose with streaming. So the first is privacy. Streaming makes it significantly easier to track and surveil users. Oh, sorry, I lost my center view. The second is fair use. A few contracts in the US that you would sign with streaming companies have fair use protections and contract preemption, which means that streaming contracts can override the law, which is an issue that we're very interested in exploring. And control and ownership. So streaming means that the companies control the content and what's called rent-seeking behavior, which is paying $9.99 per month in perpetuity, which gives them unprecedented control over access. So I have two examples, and they're both pretty old, although there are other examples. These just happen to be my favorite. There was back in the early 2000s, Nook was a Kindle competitor. And what they did was when they sold books, which were heavily protected by DRM and stuck on the Nook format, in order to make people not think of a Kindle while they were reading their Nook, they changed every instance of Kindle to Nook. So people started like nooking lights or like nooking fires because they would kindle a fire, kindle a light, and it angered a lot of consumers and they changed it back. And the one that the really famous one was that I think back in 2004, 2005, maybe a little later, Amazon lost the rights to 1984 and it just disappeared from, every user's device who had ever used it. And that might sound like a Big Brother situation, but it's actually pretty common. I mean, it's a little bit different, but like if you've ever been watching a Netflix show and then it suddenly disappears because they don't have access to it anymore, they don't have the rights to it anymore. That is a little bit less of a stark example, but you're never going to finish that show unless they're able to regain the rights to it. Dave Hansen from Authors Alliance, who I'll bring up again, did a really wonderful presentation about the different terms and contracts and the ways that they often contradict each other, or they say things that are unexpected. And so what I'm going to read out loud, which is in his presentation. And again, I'm happy to share parts of that out with folks at some point, or keep an eye out for it. He said it a few times, which says that Apple and its licensors reserve the right to change, suspend, remove, or disable access to any iTunes product, content, or materials comprising a part of the iTunes service at any time without notice. In no event will Apple be liable for making these changes. So even though many of us, I would say most of us, do not actually read the fine print anymore because there's so much fine print to read, this is a fact of engaging in any kind of online service, in particular iTunes. So iTunes can take away your access. It can change the materials on it, and they hold no liability. And so this is an example of what's called contract preemption, which is contracts overriding what is legal to do, which is to own materials and utilize them under fair use. So what does this mean for consumer property rights? Okay. Which analogy would you use to understand access to streaming content? You could say a film reel at your local cinema, a library book, or a family heirloom in a safe deposit box. Go ahead and drop it in the chat. And the answer could be none of them. So film reel. So the answer is kind of all in none. With a film, as everyone says, you can see it multiple times, but you never possess it, much less own the reel. With the cloud, you pay to listen to a song or watch a program, but the cloud provider owns the copy, literally the hard drive on its server. So any rights you have would be rooted in contract, not property. So film is definitely the closest analogy. But if we take it as a library book, the server, like the library, is full of copies of works. When you want to access your purchase, the work is pulled from the shelves, the metaphorical shelves of the cloud, and it's transmitted to your device in some of the same ways that you could get a library book and take it home. But again, you do not own the copy on the cloud server any more than you own a book from the library. So a family heirloom, you pay for a safe deposit box and it waits for you until you are ready to access it. Just like a stamp collection at a bank, you own it even if you don't currently possess it, which is probably the least analogous metaphor. And in certain ways, what we're sort of looking for is we want to be able to own something even if we don't currently possess it. But the thing is that copyright law can easily make sense of the first two analogies, because they fit into the question of copies and works through tangible and intangible work. So a tangible work is a library book and an intangible work is film. But none of them truly capture it, which is one of the reasons why copyright laws can still really not make sense of digital ownership, and in many ways is an insufficient framework by which to view it, but it's the one that we have. So conceptually, it makes a lot more sense to talk about an intangible property right in the file, which is a collection of bits that this is what you do for bits, that encode the movie, which is detached from any kind of particular physical copy, in much of the same way that you can own or transfer stock, like an intangible interest in a corporation, you can own and transfer rights in your cloud purchase, and that's what's called transfer of title. And I'll talk a little bit more about transfer of title in just a minute. I promise it's not going to be this theoretical for much longer. So from the perspective of copyright law, there are a lot of problems. So identifying what you own in terms that copyright law can comprehend is a challenge. The vocabulary is limited to tangible copies and intangible works, and I'll give an example of this in just a minute with the Internet Archive lawsuit. Even though you might own a stamp collection in the bank, you don't literally own part of Apple's server. Property rights in this way relate to something much less concrete. So from a technical perspective, these are rights that the cloud provider could easily accommodate by lending. But then they would lose access to a lot of the consumer data and the consistent rent-seeking behavior that we see in cloud streaming. So there are lots of different issues that also should be addressed, which is that we have a lack of confidence in the ability to access copyrights in the future. There are questionable first sale rights. First sale is the right of is your right to do with content what you wish once you own it. You do not own the content on the cloud, so you cannot do with it what you want, hence the EULA, the end user licensing agreement that I read out loud from iTunes. And the law hasn't yet recognized intangible property rights in digital form, just like the film example. So the division of rights between creators and consumers might look different for intangible property, but the key is that your rights would be determined by default property rules, not the minutia of an end user licensing agreement or a EULA. By calling what we stream property, it would shift the balance of power from sellers to buyers, and responsibility for defining rights from lawyers at Amazon and Apple to courts and legislators. And this is all from end of ownership. I am pulling almost directly from the text. It really explains all of this very, very well. So what they call it is a mutant form of contract law, which I really like. So, but the interests of the public and the author are the backbone of copyright. There is a public interest reason for copyright to exist. Otherwise, we would not have libraries and we would not have a lot of the fair use rights that we hold dear and try to protect as librarians. So the public interest could also be a counterbalance to private rights. It's historically significant and it's currently significant as well. As we know, one of the other reasons for this is that technology moves quickly and copyright hasn't really been updated since the 70s. So it's a very different world that we're living in. The other thing that comes up a lot is that there's an extreme corporate fear of piracy, despite everything sort of being available on the internet. There is a corporate fear of piracy, which has led to these extraordinary measures, including the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and also including DRM and streaming services that are highly restrictive. But by replacing ownership with licensing, corporations are erasing all the attendant rights that are associated with ownership, like exhaustion or first sale. I really like this way of framing it, which says that the current attempts by corporations to control content makes the assumption that every member of the public is a pirate and has to be controlled, rather than assuming that that people who are accessing content just want to gain access to reading, to cultural material, to scientific material, and this framing of users, consumers, readers as pirates is extremely deleterious culturally, and it's also a huge problem for libraries. So the question is, can libraries own what they buy digitally? There's a deception of describing licensed material or rented content as a sale. And there was actually just a law in California that was passed, I don't know if anyone saw it, that said that companies can no longer do that in the state of California. It's like, if you are licensing content, if you're renting it, you can no longer describe it as a sale. And I can, when we're in the Q&A, I can find an article about it and drop it in the chat. Privacy rights also are transferred to a corporation, which provides publishers control of both production and distribution, which means that they could deny content to anyone, in particular libraries. There's, as we've seen with the cost of ebooks and the cost of textbooks and the cost of digital resources, the differential pricing causes harm to the public interest. And the rise of licensing also undermines a number of other pieces of copyright law, including interlibrary loan, preservation, and other fair uses, educational uses, and other fair uses that could be used by libraries. So some of this has to do with how needlessly complicated distribution has gotten. Most works have limited commercial viability after the first 5 years. Most works have limited commercial viability in any case. There used to be a way to sort of determine how long commercial viability should be. There still is, but it's what one of our advisory board members, Guy Charles Gonzalez, calls a knowable unknown. Libraries could help track these metrics, but they don't even receive metrics back for the most part on how library lending impacts publishing and impacts digital content in general. So I have a little bit of time to do a little bit of discussion, but I also recognize that on Zoom it can be awkward because I have to kind of sit here and wait. But please do drop your thoughts on this in the chat of, anything you've experienced in your own library, in your own institution, in your own school, in terms of what it's like to own or not own content. And maybe we can read some of them out at the end. And don't be shy. So now I'm going to talk about the topic that I think is on a lot of people's minds. Has everyone heard of the Hachette versus Internet Archive case? It's, again, a little bit hard to see on Zoom, but folks have heard of it. I can go over the very basics of it. So Hachette versus Internet Archive is a case that's been going on since 2020. During the height of the pandemic, when 85% of all libraries were closed, the Internet Archive dropped all lending restrictions on their open library product, which is scans of physical books that they lent out normally on a one-to-one basis. They have a warehouse of millions of books that they keep sequestered from the public in order to lend them out on a one-to-one basis. The vast majority of these millions of books are either out of print, public domain, or orphaned. They're also just scans. They're not readable, they're not OCRable, they're not ebooks, they are scans, effectively PDF scans of books. They took all the lending restrictions off and provided them for free to the public on a limited time basis. The publishers, Hachette in particular, 4 major publishers, were pretty upset about this and immediately sued. So there's sort of this feeling of the case feeling pretty vintage now. It's been 4 years, and yet it's continuing to be pursued. They did not win at the District Court of New York when they argued on a fair use platform. So they argued fair use, that this was a fair use because it was transformative, because these are not real ebooks, these are just scans of books. And they effectively just lost on all 4 factors of fair use. There were other issues with the judgment that I'm not really going to go into because they're not related. We have plenty of coverage on our blog about it. If you're interested in going into the minutia, lots of people have covered this. But effectively, the thing to know is that Internet Archive did not win they did not win their suit. They lost in terms of all four factors of fair use. The question now that comes up is, how does this affect libraries that are not the Internet Archive? So the question is that the question that we want to ask is, are digital libraries destined to become a carousel of only the most popular titles at the moment? So while there are some heartening things in this judgment that I will go through, there are some disheartening things in this judgment that I will also go through. The issue that is really coming to the forefront for me, for us as people who are librarians, is that the judges made an implication that libraries can only obtain digital books that already have licenses through a proprietary app environment. And so to explain that is the judges said that that anything that already has a license, any book that already has a license, cannot be digitized and lent. And so this is a problem, because it once again puts all control into the distributor's hands. Historically, distribution has been in the control of publishers, which is fine, but because of the way that intermediaries work in the digital environment, this puts the majority of the power into the hands of the Overdrives, the Amazons of the world, when Amazon is estimating that 85% of all digital books are lent through Amazon. I don't know if anyone's tried to buy a digital book outside of Amazon recently, like outside of the Kindle environment. It's quite hard. And if you want to read it on a Kindle, you're just kind of out of luck. But, you know, the judges wrote that the library ebook market, lending market is thriving. Publishers and their authors have tapped into a profitable growing market. So it overlooks a number of key facts. So more than 90% of the public library digital market is controlled by Overdrive, which is private equity leverage and has been sold multiple times. It bypasses the library through their app, which causes most digital readers to think that Libby is their library. I don't know if I know it's probably not a lot of public librarians, but probably everyone has experienced this, where everybody thinks that they're reading from their library, but they're reading through Libby, which is no one's fault. This is how they've designed the product. So in the worst case scenario of saying that libraries cannot digitize and lend already licensed ebooks, it gives publishers carte blanche to continue to force libraries into these unconscionable monopoly contracts and lock them into closed surveillance apps, which is very sad. But in the best case scenario, there's another world, right, where publishers and libraries and authors band together to create services that support libraries. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing on that in just a moment. So now we have format shifting and fair use, like not to make everybody's eyes glaze over in boredom, but whole book digitization is really important for libraries. They rely on format shifting in a variety of contexts. So the court seems to view digital lending as totally distinct from format shifting. And they say in the decision, like, if Sony, the seminal case that said that if you tape something off television, you are not violating copyright. Like, thank God, my mother was obsessed with Days of Our Lives. And like, I do not know how she would have watched it had the Sony case not happened. Like, she was not going to sit down at 4 p.m. every day. She wanted to tape all the episodes and then fast forward through the boring parts. But if Sony had not happened, that would have been a violation of copyright. But now the judges are saying, like, if Sony had come up today, we actually don't know if we would have ruled that transformative. But Sony is very, very important because it understands that format shifting is a fair use. And so similarly, digitizing a book to lend and keeping a 1-to-1 ratio of an owned to loaned book is a similar process to making a photocopy. And so one of the things I really want to make clear is that the National Emergency Library, which is what the Internet Archive got sued over, is not controlled digital lending. It was controlled digital lending when they were keeping a ratio of the number of books they owned to the number of books they lent. It was a sort of a different a different thing. They could still say it was fair use, but it was not controlled digital lending as it's conceived of by many, many libraries. And that's not that's not a criticism of the Internet Archive. They were doing what they felt was right, but it is a very different process to the one that most libraries would use, which replicates the print lending process almost exactly digitally, in a way that respects copyright by maintaining the ratio of 1:1. So similar to a photocopy or when you buy a book, the publishers and the author were paid when their work was purchased or acquired. So the joke that I tell sometimes is like, what do big publishers want to come after next? Use bookstores? Like, it's kind of the same logic. So there are lots of weaknesses in the judgment, which is that it focuses only on the transformativeness in the first factor and ignores the purpose. Their market harm analysis relies on common sense and proving a negative rather than empirical data. The Internet Archive went to great lengths to prove that publisher revenues were not affected by their decision to open up the National Emergency Library, and the judges just rejected that, even though it was empirical, relying on like, of course it did, even though that doesn't really make any sense. Again, as I was talking about, the reading of Sony is pretty problematic. And the last is that it operates from a permission-based theory of copyright. So you don't need permission to lend a book. If you did, again, libraries would not exist. Although that's not obviously not all that libraries do, but if we lived in a world without first sale, then a library or a school or even a person would have to ask the copyright owners permission every single time they lent materials, which is illogical and time consuming. But unfortunately, that seems to be the framework into which we're moving legally. So Dave Hansen, who I've mentioned already, a wonderful thinker on these issues and writer who runs Authors Alliance, which is a sister organization to Library Futures. They're great. He wrote that, the ruling is only going to benefit the largest publishers and the most prominent authors, but for most, it's going to end up harming much more than it will help. But he also wrote, and Kyle K. Courtney wrote as well on his blog, that this ruling is just in New York. It's one jurisdiction. It does not apply to everyone, and also that it's very much based on the Internet Archive, which brings me to my next point, which is that the Internet Archive's Controlled Digital Lending project is very important and also very idiosyncratic. Most libraries cannot afford to keep an enormous warehouse of millions of books and lend them out on a server on a one-to-one basis. The NISO CDL Technical Standards Working Group, which is much beleaguered, you can read about it on my blog, on the Library Futures blog, the post that I wrote about having chaired this committee. It is still in limbo, but these are the technical standards they don't want you to see. And so the five reasons why a library might do CDL under the technical standards framework, which is really just a framework for digital lending, is if they've done a fair use or for sale analysis, that they've secured permission from the publisher, that there is no ebook license available, that there's an agreement with a vendor or publisher to allow CDL of its undigitized back file. There are a lot of really good examples of libraries making back files or backlist titles more available to the public through digitization, and publishers saying, oh, hey, like actually, this is really profitable for us. This happened when I was at O'Reilly as well. Like, oh, wow, like our backlist is an untapped resource. And then working with a publisher in order to ensure that they can get the profit that they deserve from their back file. And the last is a rarity or uniqueness of specialized material. And if it's too fragile to be lent, that's another reason why CDL might be useful. So I've talked a little bit about how the Internet Archive case differs from the way that CDL is used at other libraries and how it's the same. So as I've said, the Internet Archive case is quite different. Controlled digital lending is still safe in the way that many libraries use it for reserves materials or for digitizing fragile or rare or out of print materials. The problem is that this plus the publishers came after the NISO CDL standards group in order to suppress the technical standards for controlled digital lending, and it's created a major chilling effect across the community. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the question and answers, but in short, controlled digital lending is alive and well and still protected, just not necessarily in the way that we thought it was. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing at Library Futures in order to think and talk about what an ownership model for digital books might look like. We worked with the DPLA and a number of other organizations, including the Internet Archive, to write a series of principles on library ownership of digital books. And the first collection of owned materials were just released on the Palace Project. So there are 83,000 titles that are now available for libraries to own rather than license on the Palace Project. It's really exciting. They use these principles as a way to ensure that there is a clear transfer of title to the library in order to purchase and lend digital materials and digital books. And those can, of course, be found on our website. So my second master's degree, as was said, is in public policy. I love public policy. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some solutions that have been proposed. This is a petition from Public Knowledge. This is not led by libraries. It's interesting. It's one way to work with advocacy groups that care about libraries, like Public Knowledge. I think that there are also library-led initiatives that are and will be very important. We're working on an open standards coalition with Columbia University and New York University as the library leaders, for example. And we will have a sign-on letter for institutions to sign on to support open standards within the next couple of months. We'll be presenting it at CNI in December. And so if you're interested in working with us to support open standards in publishing with a coalition of libraries and publishers, please let us know. But the public knowledge advocacy for digital libraries has been really interesting, and we partner with Public Knowledge a lot. And I think that their work, as well as sort of finding unlikely allies, can be very important. So then there's the Library Futures draft legislation, access to ebooks, which is currently in, I think, 7 states, and has been fought tooth and nail by publishers. We're convening a group of libraries and librarians in the Mid-Atlantic region in particular, but also around the country to talk about, what other kinds of advocacy solutions might there be in order to gain better pricing, better access, more diverse materials, and better relationships with small and independent publishers. We'll be convening that in the spring, hopefully. So again, you can reach out to me if you're interested in joining. It's mostly led by public libraries, in particular, the New Jersey Library Association and Connecticut Library Association. This is a coalition that we're just recently a part of called Recreate, which is a fair use coalition. We're now on the website, but when I made this graphic, we had not been added to the website, so I kind of like snuck us in the corner. But it's a great coalition of a lot of consumer advocacy and tech organizations, and we're really happy to be a part of it. It was just on our blog and in our newsletter this week. So there are a lot of different things we could do. This is a partial small list of different policy and advocacy solutions that we could partake in as libraries and communities who are interested in these issues. So letters and what are called nastygrams. So a number of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, Senator Wyden and Issue sent a letter to publishers and to vendors asking who controls the pricing? Who controls the materials? What are you going to do about long-term preservation? And you know what? They never answered. We pushed on it, and so we got a letter sent, but we could continue to send letters through Congress and through other interested parties. There are obviously consumer advocacy campaigns. I'll talk about one that we did in just a moment. Patron education is obviously always going to be incredibly important. Patrons should know about these issues without being shamed for using the services that they love. Boycotts, of course, there was a very successful boycott, I think in 2018-19 of Macmillan that got Macmillan to change their pricing. There are also soft boycotts, which is, you know, a less intense way to say we're just going to spend less money on these materials. We don't have the money, we're going to spend less money, and being very clear why. Open letters, like the letter we're going to write on open standards or going to release on open standards, is another advocacy solution. Hill outreach, we've done a few Hill walks, and so getting libraries and librarians to talk to their senators about issues other than just funding, even though funding is obviously phenomenally important, to talk about issues of privacy and intellectual freedom and these questions of digital ownership and vendors, is something that we are very much interested in and have facilitated and supported over the years and are hoping to continue to. Another really exciting new initiative that we're working on is to establish a national commemorative day for the public domain. And so we'll be doing a lot of Hill outreach around that. It should not be particularly controversial. Everybody loves public domain. But convincing a bunch of rights holders that it really is that we just love the public domain, and we're hoping to make a lot more connections in the Senate so that we can really talk to senators and Congress about the issues that we care about as libraries and librarians. Joint statements of principles, like the open standards, again, standard setting like in NISO, if it doesn't get held hostage through a bunch of publishers. I believe that the NISO technical standards for controlled digital lending are still up on their website. They are in draft form because they were not approved by the publisher members of NISO, and NISO is a consensus organization. But they're worth reading. They're really interesting. They're very detailed about how to lend digital books. And the last, of course, is litigation. Litigation is long, it is costly. We're nonprofits, we're libraries, but it's absolutely always a tool in the toolbox of the things that we can do. So here's an example of advocacy campaign that we worked on, that we ran, called eBooks for Us. It's a series of games and cartoons about ebooks and contracts that Michelle Reed put together. It's fantastic. It's really fun. It's a great way to show patrons about what's been going on. You can sign up for updates. You can send it to your legislators. It's a really, really great resource. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about building library controlled technology. So Project Reshare is a wonderful project that is a library controlled digital lending and digital lending consortial project. It's open source, it's run by its members. And we are working now with Project Reshare and 7 Stories Press to see if we can create an appless experience for patrons to access one community supported digital book. So that sounds a lot more confusing than it is. But what we're trying to figure out is if by using Reshare and by using the tools at hand as an open source project, if we can bring patrons back into the catalog. So if you look for a book, the book that is being promoted by your library is their community read, and it was just chosen. It's a book on a collection of stories on immigration, and this pilot will be run in Iowa, I think in Colorado, and also in Columbus, Ohio. So what we want to see is, particularly in the public library context, if you go to your library catalog because your whole community is reading a book, and you click on the link, and it brings you to an interface that's not Libby, that's its own interface that is open source, controlled by libraries, and is within the library ecosystem of metrics and of data and of patron privacy, and that can support publishers in a way that is authentic, and that is much more of the traditional relationship that particularly small publishers have had with libraries. we're going to see if it works, and we'll be testing that over the next few months. We're getting there. It's actually being built. It's really exciting. And at the same time, one of our interns, Ariana Alcaraz, who's wonderful, is writing a report on how authors want to work with libraries in the digital age. How do authors, agents, publishers, how can we work better with authors? How can we work better with academics? How can we work better with people who write and people who create and people who produce culture in order to bring it to our communities? Thank you, Joe. I'm almost done. So the last is getting a seat at the table. So how do we get a seat at the table with publishers, with other libraries? The reason why we were able to do this project, for example, with Seven Stories Press, which is a press that many of us really admire, really wonderful small press that's, I would say at the size at this point, mid-size. How do we get a seat at the table with them? The only reason we were able to do this was because someone opened up a conference for independent publishers and librarians to get together and talk about what we can do together. How can we get a seat at the table with deans and with library boards around the country? How do we do the best, most valuable work that we can together and advocate for that work in a way that reaches people? How do we make an impact? So these are just some questions to go into the Q&A with, and then we can sort of ask questions and discuss. And now for my most controversial t-shirt that I owned, which is, it's not copyright, you hate, it's capitalism. So no matter how you feel about capitalism, it's not the time. The fact is that unrestrained companies and unregulated companies are really hurting libraries. But the march toward a totally commodified digital environment in service of vendors is not inevitable. And so with our remaining time, I'm hoping to open the floor a little bit to talk about ideas, the things we can do together as a community to make the situation better, storytelling, and also to just open up the floor for questions. So thank you so much. I am Jennie at libraryfutures.net. I'm very easy to reach. And I'm on new Twitter called Blue Sky at littlewow.bsky.social. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennie. And yeah, we have about 30 minutes, maybe just a hair less, to discuss and ask questions and see where the conversation goes. And something that I thought of, Jennie, while you were talking, I'm a former academic librarian myself, and the question of digital ownership comes up because some of our libraries, our SUNY libraries, certainly purchase digital copies of textbooks for the students to access. And yeah, what are they purchasing and what do they own and what rights do they have? Students, I think, become pretty dependent on library provided textbooks, especially when they're expensive. And we had situations where like a subscription ran out or the publisher pulled the book completely, leaving the students kind of at a loss. So I guess just what are your thoughts on digital textbooks specifically? And yeah, do libraries own them? Can they own them? I don't know.
It depends. The joke in copyright is always that the answer is it depends. If you've ever been to the copyright game show at ALA, everybody cheers every time a copyright lawyer says it depends an answer to a question. So it really depends on the contract that you have. It really depends on the access that the institution has negotiated. Of course, bigger institutions with more leveraging power have a better way to negotiate, which is not necessarily fair, but it's true. For example, the UC contract with Elsevier had well over 600 amendments to it, which is not something that a state institution could necessarily negotiate. But to answer your question about textbooks, in particular, we do a lot less work with textbooks because there's a wonderful organization called Spark that does a lot of work with textbooks. But one of the things that they have made clear is that publishers have presented this licensing agreement with students to be inclusive access, right? Because everybody's going to get the same access to the same textbook, whereas they might not have been able to in the past. And so the US PIRGs have also been working on this issue for a really, really long time. And I would say that, you know, students should be provided access to their textbooks after they graduate. They should not live on the servers of a large corporation. How the library leverages those contracts and leverages the ability to do that is unfortunately extremely context dependent. I am not an expert in textbook access, but one of the ways that I know that some faculty members have been getting around it is, for example, or some libraries have been getting around it, is, for example, to encourage faculty members to either use Creative Commons licensed OER textbooks or to compile OER resources, open educational resources that are essentially the same as a textbook. But I also understand that now textbooks include multimedia and visuals and games and all sorts of things that aren't necessarily always able to be reproduced. But finding sympathetic faculty in order to ensure that students have long-term access to their materials is currently, I think, one of the better workarounds for this. That being said, to quote Nancy Sims, don't sign shitty contracts if you can help it, and encouraging deans and library boards to take a look at the contracts really and say, like, no, this is not acceptable to us, is another way to ensure that students can gain access to materials in the best way that is possible, although it may still be insufficient, unfortunately. I wish I had a less disheartening answer, but OER is obviously one of the best, if not the best way to ensure that students are able to own their textbooks long term.
Yes, and that's definitely what we at Senior Services,
Right.
but the collective group on this call, I think, are all advocates for that. But yeah, it is a struggle often for faculty to find resources they want, to commit to using those free resources.
Absolutely. And without, when textbook companies are offering incentives of certain nature, they're offering ease, they're offering the ability to do exactly what you want. It's really difficult to get people to commit to that. Again, I'm a student again for the first time in years, and I have one textbook where I had no choice. I just had to pay the $50 to the publishing company, and I will not have access to that after I leave my program at NYU. And that's a real shame. But again, I feel like in terms of OER work, you all are the experts. And again, I'm sure work with Spark and other organizations that are also really committed to textbook access.
Thanks. Any more questions or comments? What is happening at your library or on your campus? You can pop it in the chat, or you can just unmute, I think, and say it out loud.
Is there a movement toward collective bargaining? That's a great question. The short answer is kind of. The longer answer is yes. I think that, again, the academic context, Spark does a lot of work with that, but one of the things that I think a lot about is the way that consortia and different communities of libraries and institutions can come together in order to negotiate better contracts because there are higher resource expenditures from vendors. I think one of the things that is crucial that is sometimes not addressed as much in the collective bargaining conversations is there also has to be a delivery mechanism that is not controlled by a large private equity leverage corporation, that is not controlled by Elsevier. That doesn't currently exist as much as it should. And so the Palace project provides an open source solution that is a little bit more flexible for libraries to use. However, they're locked into the same kind of contracts that Overdrive is. And there are a number of different academic systems that are open source that are better delivery systems. But that being said, I think that leveraging consortia is crucial. It's something that we've been looking into. in terms of our research, I think that leveraging community organizations like Spark, also very important in terms of understanding collective bargaining, and basically coming together in as large a group. I'm so sorry.
I see.
Thank you. Coming together in as large a group as you can in order to leverage the most out of publishers and vendors that you possibly can. One of the things that is sometimes challenging as somebody who is in this space and also kind of outside of the space is I feel like there's a lot of deference to publishers and a lot of deference to vendors because they do provide great services in certain ways, and they do provide the crucial resources that we all depend on. But you go to ALA and it's, you know, an enormous Elsevier sign hanging next to an Oxford University Press, hanging next to all these like huge vendor signs. And, you know, I think that's a problem. I think vendor capture is really a problem, and that libraries have a lot more leverage, particularly collectively, than they seem to sometimes think that they do. And supporting people in understanding the contracts that they're working with and understanding how to come together for a better deal is a focus of many of the organizations in this space. And I do think that at some point we are going to have to say enough is enough, but that time has not come yet. But you know, the question is are we heading into a world in which quality resources can only be accessed by institutions with money or people with money? And unfortunately, that future seems like it's in view, you know, that libraries digitally will just sort of provide access to materials that are owned by large corporations and vendors. And I think coming together in as large a group as possible and just trying to work toward collective action is super important. The other thing, if you are interested, we do webinars and seminars and other kinds of ways of engaging with people on how to read contracts. 2023 was the first year of the contract at Library Features, and we're hoping to have many years of contracts, because contracts are, in fact, what kind of makes the world go round with a lot of our work digitally. So I see Jenica in the chat says, a decade ago, I was library famous for arguing that our relationship with publishing was broken, abusive, and needed to be reinvented. It's depressing at best to come back to libraries and realize nothing has changed. Yeah, and in certain ways, it's gotten a lot worse, right? The Internet Archive case was not great. The continued privatization of resources and the continued emphasis on what Rebecca Giblin and Cory Doctorow called choke point capitalism, which is this idea that choke points are what are standing in between creators and their rights. And that has only expanded. Digital privacy rights are eroding. So yes, it is depressing, but you know, I don't think I could do this work if I didn't believe that it was a winnable problem and that it was something that we could chip away at and make better over time. But the only way that we can do that is through, to get back to the first question, collective bargaining and collective action.
Thanks for that. Any more questions, or anyone want to share your experiences with this? What's happening on your campus or in your library? And I guess I have a follow-up question, Jenny, if no one else is. How do you think AI is going to play into all of this with copyright and, you know, either accessing library information that is copyrighted or creating newly non-copyrighted? Where are we headed in the future, and how can our libraries kind of prepare for that?
So AI is on everyone's mind. The Copyright Office, of course, has famously said that the outputs of AI are fair use, which is good. We want expanded fair use rights across the board. Fair use is a good thing. It is unique to the American system. It is, we love fair use. That being said, it's complicated like everything else. To give a really negative example is that we've been working on a community response to a public library vendor called Hoopla. And so in the last year, we've been working on this for 2 years. In the last year, we've started to see that Hoopla has begun to inject AI written summaries of books, popular books, into their system. So they suggest on the front page, for example, that you search for Colleen Hoover. So if you search for Colleen Hoover, you get a 30,000 word synopsis called Colleen Hoover, the best works. So that is a pretty negative example of AI kind of finding its way into our collection. Hoopla is an all-you-can-eat system, so you have to ingest the whole thing unless you manually block. So this is already becoming a big problem. I think AI is like every other technology, not in a vacuum, and it's has both good and bad. I've seen incredible innovations in libraries with the use of AI, including cleaning up and supporting MARC records. I've seen uses to support students, particularly multilingual students, in producing texts, in reading out loud for the blind and visually impaired. I've seen just incredible uses for fair use and educational uses of AI. And then, of course, there are the less positive uses. For example, I'm pretty sure it's Taylor and Francis licensed a few 100,000 pieces of material from their authors without their consent to an AI company in order to use for training data. So the question of, compensation, rights, permission, and consent, it becomes a huge issue, particularly when you're ingesting huge corpora of work. I think it's scary to think that it could also move us toward a permissions-based framework that is generally supported by authors. However, I do think that there are a number of very positive uses of AI, particularly in libraries. Particularly to support people with different abilities to start to actually enforce the Marrakesh Treaty, which is famously not super well enforced by publishers, to ensure that we have a much more accessible ebooks. I think that there's a lot of promise in OCR technology that takes physical books and allows them to be much more easily read. But again, I think it is a question of control, like everything else. What I would be afraid of, and what it seems like is happening, is that, we saw the rise of social media, we've seen the rise of cloud computing, we've seen the rise of all of these huge technologies within only a 20-year period. And we've lost control of them. They have become the domain of huge companies. They've become the domain of private equity, of venture capital, and of the rich. And I think that, the more that we can work together and come together as public interest organizations, as public service institutions, the more likely we are to be able to shape the kind of future that we actually want, even if it's just our small little nation corner, because I do not think that the 51 people on this call are going to single-handedly stop the billions of dollars being made by OpenAI. But I do think that we can teach patrons to use tools in ways that are responsible. I do think that we can advocate for authors at our institutions and in our communities. And I do think that we can come together to build some better systems to do things that are helpful to our communities.
That's great. Thank you. That's a nice hopeful note. Any more questions or conversation for Jennie? All right, it doesn't look like we have more questions. We did get questions, Jennie, if you would be willing to share your slides. Send me a copy that we can attach to the recording when it's shared out. I had 2 different people ask for that. So
Yep, I'm happy to share my slides.
all right. Well, we will have about a 10 plus minute break before our next sessions begin. But thank you so much, Jenny, for your time, for your insight. This was fantastic, and I really hope everyone can take something away from it.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks everyone for staying till the end. Have a great conference.
Thank you.